So to begin with, I'd like to take you a few years back in time. Finance Watch was created in the aftermath of the financial crisis to provide really a counterweight to the financial lobby. So some members of the European Parliament, when they were confronted with several draft legislations, they felt the need for expert advice that did not come along with a private interest. So they called for the creation of a finance watch, and we hired people with a background in finance to advocate and lobby changes in the rules of the game. Since then, we have realized that lobbying alone is not enough, that unless technical proposals are supported strongly by a citizens' movement, it does not matter if you are right, you will be outpowered by the financial lobby. So this is why we have now been growing and activating our membership. And this is also why we've created the broader, more public-facing and I suppose politically ambitious Change Finance Coalition. So after the crisis, the G20 response focused only on the prudential perspective. It was, they took this approach of do no harm, but they never really questioned the fundamental structures of what created the financial crisis in the first place. They were only looking to put patches on things that had went wrong, but they never questioned the fundamental rules. And this also ended up setting the tone for the EU agenda. At the same time, the financial lobby was in full swing in Brussels, and an estimate from 2014 says that there are about 1,700 financial industry lobbyists in Brussels alone. And at Finance Watch, we are 12. So you can see a bit the imbalance in power. I guess the rules of the games haven't changed because the debate has really been captured by the financial lobby. This image is an example of what that means. So this is an example of the Deutsche Bank, and you can see that the industry is really good at influencing the EU. They have a huge network and they're very well coordinated. So if you hear, for instance, one thing from someone, you can say, okay, this is the opinion of one person. But the industry can hire resources to make sure that it comes from all different directions so that the EU begins to think, okay, we're hearing it from so many different directions, perhaps this is the right thing. Similarly, here you see some examples of public affairs consultancies. So it's not the bank alone that is doing the lobbying, but they are working with several different consultancies, which then have other clients that help to influence the debates. So this shows that really to track the real number of lobbyists vested in the financial sector is almost impossible to count. It's very difficult to really gauge just how many industry lobbyists are involved. And it's no surprise that almost every progressive regulation in the last 10 years has either been diluted or discarded. So what needs to change? We think that I mean, of course, there are many different issues, but if we really had to focus on one crucial issue, then it's a word that when I first heard, I hated. It's called financialization, and it's really a wonky word that is such a mouthful and a killjoy in any conversation. But it really nails the core of what needs to change with finance. So perhaps first a bit of context. over the last 30 to 40 years, governments around the world have shifted a big portion of their activities from the public sector to the private sphere. And they have introduced fiscal policies that have reduced taxes on the very richest companies. And they have also steadily, progressively lifted many of the rules and restrictions that were in place for financial actors and for the markets. So there's been a progressive deregulation. And with these fewer rules to govern them, financial actors have been completely, I guess, the financial actors have been liberated to introduce new ways of working that can increase profits for the finance sector. So for instance, in this image right here, you see that there is a tremendous growth in the size of the finance sector, not just in absolute terms, but also in relative terms to global GDP. And yeah, in 1980, financial assets were valued at 12 trillion, and now they have surged to 242 trillion. But in this is a figure from 2000, oops, sorry. This is a figure from 2013. Trying to, do you still see my screen? Okay, all right. Right. So I guess what does financialization mean? I think that in essence, it refers to the increase in the role of finance in the running of our economies. So financial intermediaries and technologies have really gained unprecedented influence over our daily lives. And there is a rise in the power of the finance sector, not just in the volume of financial trading, but also in the increasing variety of dealings and their connection with all parts of our lives. And I think that here it's important to take a moment and think about, what is the purpose that finance is intended to serve, and how did this perhaps, how did we lose this purpose along the way? And we really had several debates about this, and we think that finance is a powerful tool that can give direction to our economies and our societies. So it should be, the main purpose of finance should be to serve all people as well as the planet. So for example, if you go back to what we historically envisioned, maybe just simple banks doing, then we were supposed to take all of our savings from productive labor, and we were supposed to put them in the banks, and then the banks were supposed to make loans to new businesses and initiatives, and these were investments in our collective future. But something really changed along the way. So in the last 30 to 40 years, there has been a change in what the markets actually do in their business models. So I know that in the EU, it's something like 20% or so of funds from finance go out to businesses. So where is the rest of it going? There's a book called Makers and Takers by Rana Faruhar, where she says that only 15% of all capital flowing out of US financial institutions are, so by that I mean banks and insurance companies and real estate trusts, hedge funds, anybody that moves money around. So only 15% is being invested in businesses. So the big question is that where is the rest of it going? And the answer is that because of all these fewer rules, the finance sector, instead of meeting the needs of society, is taking the way that makes most, that it takes the way that it can make most money for itself. So the money ends up being in a closed financial loop, where the private finance sector dedicates most of its efforts and energies dealing with itself. It chases tiny margins from huge transactions in what amounts to really a zero-sum game between financial firms. And these activities are very risky, and they don't address all of our societal issues. So I guess as an example, in the 1960s, shares were held for about 4 years on average. And today, the average share is only held for 20 seconds. So it's not really, it's not really done with an intention to invest in our long-term future. So I guess the main thing is that finance needs to stop betting and start investing in our future, and it needs to move away from short-term speculative activities that are simply focused on shuffling money around the system. So this is here you can see how this trend deeply affects inequality. So it's really something where money is being transferred to the rich. More and more money is being transferred to the rich. I think I skipped a slide. Yeah, this one. I think that this graph is really telling. It shows how the deep transformation of our economies. It really shows how the shift from public to private capital played a big role. And this is a transfer of wealth, not just in terms of economic or political power, but it ends up leading to a loss of democracy. Because when funds move from public to private, we also no longer have democratic control over what gets built and what doesn't, where society invests and where it doesn't. This is also, this probably also explains the rise of populism, because politicians and strong political leaders pretend to defend the people's interests, and they use probably migrants as scapegoats, when actually this is the underlying problem that is causing financial inequality. Right, and of course, speculation has also resulted in a lot of instability. So you see that with deregulation, we led up to the crisis. Now, yeah, this was the figure that I was looking for, that about 28% of funding right now from European banks goes to non-financial businesses. So people might say that it's been 10 years since the crisis and now everything is fine and we don't need to worry anymore, but this is really far from the truth. And if you have a look at all of these trends, you will see that we're still in a place where we have a long way to go. And the big question is, what do we do now? And this is a bit the changing rhetoric. If you see, at least within the EU, here you see the EU commissioner asking for a new boost for growth and investment. You see the the call for a capital markets union, which is the new flagship project of the EU Commission. You have Mr. Franz Timmermans, who is the VP of the Commission, who is asking for a project for better regulation, aiming at making European legislation better for citizens. But is this really true? Because you know, all the promises that politicians made right after the crisis, it seems like their memories are short, and we aren't really getting there. I think that the main thing that we need to look forward to is return the area of finance back to citizens. We have to realize that this is not something that should be kept only up to the experts. This is almost a weapon that experts use to say that, oh, you know, this is finance, we understand it, you don't, so just leave it up to us. That's not true. The complexity of finance is really only a smoke screen, and as soon as you start to ask the fundamental questions, it's easy for citizens to get involved. This is actually a flagship report that we had written along with a faith-based group, Caritas France, and it talks about the evolution of the financial system over the last 40 years. It really goes into the details of what is wrong with this evolution and explores ways to fix the fundamental flaws. And this report is, yeah, it's a report, but I think that it's accessible to everyone, and anyone can follow the core arguments through this. The main thing we need is that we really need a social movement that demands a paradigm shift. And this movement needs to demand that we definancialize our economies so that we can return to sovereignty, and we are not ruled by economic and political and financial forces. So we started with only the beginning of this. We used the anniversary of the 10-year anniversary of the crash to remind everyone that these important jobs are still not done, and that we missed a golden opportunity to fix the financial system, and to show that actually much of the problems of finance have not just remained the same, but even gotten worse. One of the things that I think is really important going ahead is that we need to connect the masses of people by linking their daily lives and their daily societal goals to the issues of finance. So we can't begin a conversation with someone starting with finance, because most people will say that, oh, I'm not really interested in the subject and it doesn't affect me. So we need to tell the story backwards, and work out how can we find inroads into people's hearts and minds to make them see that this is really a crucial issue of our time. So this is a screen grab from the changefinance.org website. And we started right before this 10 Years On campaign to collect ideas from several different organizations and individuals about what a future financial system could look like. And we need to do a lot more work on refining this effort. So we've created a vision for a financial system, and now we need to identify what are the specific policy goals that will make this vision possible. So we're already very much in the process. And we also need to work with pioneers who can show that, who can show that these positive changes are possible. And I believe that the NAESI Forum will be a great place to connect with them. That's about all.
Great. Thank you, Shonan. Thank you very much for that presentation. Fascinating and wonderful.